Uh, Hello, everyone. My name is Len Tooley. And first of all, I just want to thank Sarah for her really amazing presentation. I think and work a lot about the idea of resilience. So that was really helpful to sort of begin the discussion. And I think our presentations will really complement each other because I'm going to be talking about what resilience might look like on a structural level. Um, and I also just wanted to take a moment to thank the CBRC and everyone who's made this conference possible. It's my second time here, and I just love it. I love the atmosphere and the people, and it's a great city. So thank you, everyone. Fortunately for me, I submitted a very academic abstract to the CBRC for this conference, and they accepted it. And this presentation is actually based on a paper that I wrote in a course finishing my master's degree. So I have just finished a master's in public health at the University of Toronto. I also work at a national HIV organization called CADI, and I do sort of capacity building and knowledge translation there, and HIV and STI counseling through Hassle Free Clinic in downtown Toronto as well. So I'm very happy that the CBRC invited me to present. But I'm I know I look a little messy, but that's how I like it. So I'm also known as Lenora Ramona Lovelace II. To be honest, I think I'm actually the first, but I like to hedge my bets, so if someone else has claimed the title, you're welcome to tell me. My real presentation is going to be called Stick It to the Structures. Let's get a move on to address HIV among folks in the masculine realm of the gender multiverse who do and or love each other. So while I'm being a little bit facetious with that, I really wanted to rename my title because, I have a big sort of Catholic confession to make, and that's that I don't actually identify as gay or as a man. I'm queer, and for me that means that the sexual possibilities are sort of many more, and that really works for me. And I also don't really like the parts of my personality that some people might say are masculine or feminine to be called masculine or feminine, because that's never really worked for me. So I think that I act queer too. So I identify as genderqueer. And we don't really often get to say this out loud to a group of people, and so I sort of thought I would take the opportunity to do that. That being said, though, I do have a lot of sex with gay men. I work with gay men. I work for gay men. I've had the words "gay men" in my job title before. But I just wanted to reflect sort of my diversity and how I sort of relate to that title. And I'm not going to really go into a definition of gay men and MSM because Sarah, I think, did a really good job. And we all sort of have our own opinions of that. So to get into sort of down to business a little bit, a few months ago, around the time of the International AIDS Conference, there was a special edition of The Lancet that specifically focused on HIV in men who have sex with men in sort of a global perspective. If you haven't seen it, I really suggest taking a browse through it. It's got some really amazing and thoughtful articles. It's all online, so you can Google it. And in this issue, there was a really awesome article titled Comparisons of Disparities and Risks of HIV Infection in Black and Other Men Who Have Sex with Men in Canada, UK, and the USA, a meta-analysis. So it actually sounded pretty dry, but I gave it a whirl anyway. A meta-analysis is basically where you take a bunch of studies and combine and compare them, and by looking at them all together, you come to sort of new conclusions. And basically, they wanted to ask the question, why is it that in many parts of the world, we're seeing higher rates of HIV in Black MSM than in other MSM? And they sort of looked at articles that had words relevant to race, like Black, African, Caribbean, Afro-American. And what they did is they took studies from Canada, the UK, and the USA, and they ended up having 174 studies from the US, 13 from the UK, and 7 from Canada. So, wow. And the funny thing is Canada actually sort of was separated from the US and the UK in terms of their results because they didn't see the disparities in the same way in Canada. So the actual really interesting stuff came from the UK and the US, and that's what I'm going to be talking about because that sort of, helps me sell my point, I guess. It's very selfish. So they identified what they call a clear and paradoxical pattern. Across all these studies, what they found is that Black MSM were more likely than other MSM to report any preventive behavior against HIV infection. So they reported more condom use, more HIV testing, fewer sex partners, less amphetamine use, less drug use before or during sex, disclosure of HIV status to sex partners. So it seems like they're doing all the right things. But, check mark, good job. But they also had a 3-fold greater odds of testing HIV positive across all the studies, and a 6-fold greater odds of having undiagnosed HIV infection compared to other MSM. So despite all their preventive behaviors, Black MSM seem to be at higher risk of HIV. So they crunched a bunch of numbers, and I'm really simplifying and summarizing a lot. And they had this sort of eureka moment, right? There's the numbers crunching away. And what they concluded was that the disparities in HIV clinical care access and use, low income, unemployment, incarceration, and low education access, that these were the actual barriers rather than the disparities in sexual and substance use risk behaviors that were affecting things like the availability and choice of sex partners. And so basically sexual networks were being localized into neighborhoods where there was a high background HIV prevalence and community viral load and raised infection risks, so that even if they were doing something sort of lower risk, there would be more risk for HIV, right? So I really liked this study and the message, because basically what they did is they stuck it to the structures. And they say it's not about behavior. There are other things that are going on in our lives that are, in terms of the context that we live in, that are putting us at risk for HIV, that we can't even necessarily control or manage, regardless of what we do. So to move away from that a little bit, my task this summer that I was given by a professor was to look at this idea of social structural drivers of HIV. And this primarily came from a working group of AIDS 2031. And this AIDS 2031 is, as you can see here, a consortium of partners who've come together to look at what we've learned about the AIDS response, as well as consider the implications of the changing world around AIDS. I'm just going to take my wig off because it's a little hot. I'll put it on later if you want. So they had many working groups to sort of imagine what AIDS might look like in 50 years after it sort of came to be, and what we might do to address that and change those outcomes. And one of the working groups was the Social Drivers Working Group. And basically they created a lot of white papers, a lot of academic articles, and it's a lot of really good social scientists who are just really getting critical and thinking, where do we go from here? What's the next step? So that being said, I should just note that none of these ideas are really mine, so if you don't like them, you can email those people there. I'm kidding, I'm teasing, mostly. So basically what they wanted to do is think broadly about where we're at in terms of HIV. And just sort of aside from that, another thing that I found while I was sort of reading about where we're at in social determinants of health, there was an article by Sullivan that was in the same Lancet journal that basically talked about how behavioral interventions can work at helping gay, bi, MSM, queer, cis, and trans men reduce their risk. And we also sort of know that some biomedical interventions can work as well. So there's more and more evidence that things like post-exposure prophylaxis, pre-exposure prophylaxis, treating HIV to the point where someone has an undetectable viral load, we know that those can actually have an effect on incidence of HIV. But to date, our efforts haven't been sort of sufficient, even if they've been really important, and we've been working very hard at it. And so, we've, I think, explored many different answers about why that might be at the summit already. It could be that we're just not getting funded enough. If we had more money, then we could do more work and that we could actually sort of address the issue. It could be the scale of the project. So, a focus group or a group of maybe 5 to 10 guys is really great, but might not be reaching a big enough population. It could be that our interventions are not working for long enough. So they work for a while, but then they sort of peter out and behaviors change over time. Or it could be that while our interventions are effective, they're just not effective enough to sort of curb the epidemic. And we probably all know, or I at least think, that it's actually probably a combination of all of these things, right? There are all these challenges. I'm not really saying anything new yet. So obviously we have to do better. But Lenora, you say, we do know this already. The AIDS 2031 social drivers working group, they sort of started with this basic premise that after 25 years of AIDS, it has become abundantly clear that the epidemic thrives on social inequality and marginalization, at the root of which are imbalances in power relations. So duh, right? Like we know that. So how can we move forward? What do we need to do next? Let's back up a little bit and look at one of the more commonly referred to models to look at sort of structural issues around many different health issues, and this is called the social cultural model, right? And it basically starts with the individual behavior level, and where it sort of looks at individual behaviors, and it says, well, those are really affected by our relationships. So our behaviors aren't really just these isolated incidents, but they happen in the context of our relationships with other people. Those relationships occur in communities. So our communities have an impact on the types of relationships we have, which therefore impact our behaviors. And lastly, there are social and structural factors that impact our communities, right? So they sort of build layer upon layer of onion, like an onion, to come up, to explain why gay men keep on having bareback sex. Like, what is going on with them that makes them want to continue having unprotected sex and put themselves at risk for HIV, right? That's sort of what these models often sort of really try to get at and try to ask. But I think that I have some concerns with this model, and some concerns have been leveled at it by this working group. And that's really basically that at the center there, you have individual behavior, right? It always comes back to the individual, what the individual does, and sort of where their responsibility lies, and what made them or prevented them or helped them from doing the right thing. So there's sort of two major issues with that I think. The first is shame, right, and blame. As I mentioned, I'm an HIV tester, and I do HIV testing in bathhouses in Toronto. And when I actually do the testing, we do a rapid test. We do it together, and so we find out the results together at the same time. So it's a really good process where we connect, and it's like whether the result is positive, sort of reactive or non-reactive. More often than not, when I find out with someone that they're probably HIV positive, and which we assume until they get their confirmatory results, a common theme emerges that they feel ashamed of having gotten HIV, that they should have known better, that they knew that what they were doing might put them at risk for HIV, and if they only had done what they knew they should do, then they would be okay. One of the first things that they tell you when you start doing HIV testing is that you only really have 30 seconds of someone's attention span after that you discover that they have a reactive result before they just sort of go off into another space, right? So you have 30 seconds. What's that message going to be? And for me, something that I've had to process and figure out in my own life, but also in my work, is that the first message that I think is important to say is that HIV is not your fault. And that you do not deserve this, right? And a lot of people might not agree with me, and a lot of people don't agree with me when I say that, or they just they don't even understand what I'm saying. That that this isn't their fault, right? So we have so much shame around HIV, and we blame ourselves a lot, and so that this is one of the challenges that I have around focusing too much on individual behaviors. The second issue is another consequence of focusing on the idea of risky behaviors. And this is something that we can think about as a movement a little bit. This is sort of a concept that's been elaborated on by a few academics, but basically the idea is that in a society where heterosexual unions are really privileged and idealized, when we have sexual or romantic thoughts about other men, that's really socially dangerous. That is a bad thing. We're going to get in trouble. We're going to be ostracized. We're going to be bullied. It's not always this case, right? I'm not trying to make all generalizing statements, but I think that there's an argument to be made that gay thoughts are dangerous things for people to have. So picking up on that, a few academics have suggested that, or have sort of queried, if gay sex or gay love leads to danger for us. Does that mean that for some of us, danger might actually be sexy, right? When we talk about what's hot, it's sort of bad, right? It's so bad, it's good. And so we all know what I'm talking about. B, the big bareback, unprotected sex. Thank you. So I think there's this question going on, does our focus on unprotected sex and condom use and what we're doing in bed and all their sexual practices, does it actually sort of create this fetishized moment where it makes it actually like makes unprotected sex the thing that we want to do, right? Because dangerous is hot. And I think that's a really interesting and an important thing to sort of think about in our own lives, but as well as in our work. So how many? I have 5 minutes left, eh? Whew, okay. So I have like way too many slides. I'm probably just going to go through the first 2 points, but we'll see how I do. Let's talk about new approaches. So where can we go from here? First, one of the ideas that the working group wanted to do is to reorient our approaches to social and structural drivers. And they sort of present 4 key concepts throughout their literature about that. The first one is reorienting our understanding of social and structural drivers. And I've bolded and underlined drivers because I really personally prefer that word and professionally prefer that word to the idea of determinants. I don't think that anything necessarily determines our health. It might drive it in certain ways. But to say determinant to me is a little bit too unidirectional and doesn't really give very much room for us to go in any other direction. Whoops. So what that means is that we need to start thinking about drivers as things that are complex. They're fluid. They change from day to day. One driver can impact someone in one way on one day and then a different way on the next day. They're nonlinear. So, something like depression might make you more likely to have unprotected sex to a certain point, but then when you get so depressed, you just don't have sex anymore, so you're not really at risk for HIV, maybe. And so this is really reflected in the ideas of intersectionality that have been presented at the conference already. And all of these factors also interact with biological, psychological, behavior, and other social forces. So we have to really start looking at our research and our practice and our discussions in a much more complex way and realizing that it's good to talk about trends, but there's always so many exceptions that we need to really be open to those. Some of the examples of that are like I mentioned, the depression, the link between depression and risky sex. So I sort of had a really rough summer writing this paper, to be honest, and I was feeling pretty depressed. And my reaction to that was to actually not have sex. I didn't have sex for 3 months, which is really unusual for me, right? But it was great because I wasn't at risk for HIV. It was and it was wow, I felt had this sort of sense of confidence that I normally don't have. It's not so unidirectional. Gender inequality and HIV incidence is another example. So there are many countries where there's extreme gender inequality, but there aren't necessarily high rates of HIV. So just to say that gender inequality definitely leads to HIV incidence is a little bit too simplistic. And the same thing would be the idea of criminalization of same-sex behavior and HIV incidence. We don't necessarily see high HIV incidence in every country where same-sex behavior is criminalized, so far as we know. So basically, the conclusion is that our language has to shift to talking about how and in what circumstances and for whom particular combinations of factors contribute to HIV vulnerability or resilience. So a second shift is to move from the individual collective to the collective. And we've already sort of talked a lot about this as a group, that we need to be having more discussions on a community level together and with each other. Kipak's put it nicely, individual capacities are intimately tied to the enabling or disabling character of social norms, practices, or institutions. Just to go back to the bathhouse, and I know that I'm going back to that a lot, but a lot of guys will say, I'm seeing all these other guys have unprotected sex. Everyone's doing it. So I don't know what to think about that. It's making me think differently about what I should be doing. We really need to start thinking about how we are engaging with each other as a collective group, and also maybe looking to forms of collective change rather than just individual change. The third point, the third sort of reorientation they suggest is to revision our goals from short-term HIV-focused targets to long-term social transformations. And basically that means taking urgency out of the equation and emphasizing importance. It's not necessarily about we have to do this right away, right now, everything has to change right away. We have to take a longer-term approach and realize that these changes are going to be happening actually over generations. It's going to take a long time for this, and we see it happening, and we can push it along as fast as possible, but urgency maybe makes us do things that aren't necessarily the right course of action sometimes. And it also helps us to sort of rethink what measures are of success. So is HIV prevalence and incidence really, and community viral load, are these the best ways that we can measure our success as a movement, or can we measure it in other ways, like levels of stigma experienced around HIV, levels of social cohesion between positive men and negative men and unknown status men? So, thinking a little bit more long-term might help us out a little bit. Thank you. So a fourth reconsideration, and this is one that I really think is important, is to really stop delineating too much between biomedical behavior and structural interventions, and recognizing that everything is actually all the same, and that there's part of all those things in each of the programs and projects that we do. I think condoms are a really good example. I'm just going to briefly, quickly show you why. So condoms are a biomedical technology, right? Inserted receptive condoms, like they're latex, they're made in factories, they are a technology. But in order to be at all effective, they have to be used. So there are behavioral aspects to condoms, right? There are organizational aspects in the work that we do. We have to get the condoms. We have to get workers to give people the condoms and to tell people how to use the condoms, or to tell each other how to use the condoms. There are community aspects of condoms. So community activism has been essential in ensuring that we have access to condoms, and group level norms around safer sex strategies are also super important. And then structural issues as well, like policies that enhance safer sex education in high school curricula. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go over. Sorry, everybody. It's just going to happen. I know, I'm sorry, it's not nice for you, but I just have too many slides. So those are like the four main things. And really, I think that this is important when we're starting to think about things like PrEP and PEP and treatment as prevention. These are all biomedical technologies, just like we've had before. And we actually really, I think, this is my personal opinion now, need options. And when we broaden our approach to look at structural issues, and we stop worrying so much about the delineations, we can realize that we can fit everything into the same picture, and that really options are a very important thing for us to increase and do as much as we can. So the key, so again, yeah, not either or, but and also, and all of the above. So AIDS resilience is the key idea that I'm going to sort of close off with. And this is sort of the main push forward that the working group is trying to sort of encourage us to think about. And just to add another document to poor Sarah's list, they define it as a point at which individuals are effectively able to manage the risks present in their environment. And they don't actually necessarily qualify that and say what it means to manage and what a successful management is, but they sort of have that as a basic statement. And they define AIDS resilient individuals as having the ability to increase the safety of their practices, and safety can mean many different things. It means that these people can access services such as testing and treatment. They can assert their own desires and preferences, and they can claim their rights without threat to themselves, their partners, or their families. And I think that sounds pretty good. And there are three major objectives that will help us get to AIDS resilience. Those three are creating and supporting AIDS-competent communities, fostering individual agency, and building health-enabling environments. And I'll quickly just sort of describe those. AIDS-competent communities, I think, are really appropriate to the discussions we've been having in the past few days around our community, right? Like, this is the big question. And they provide some interesting ideas of what an AIDS-competent community can be, and I think that it would be great to talk about it. But I think that these are interesting things that we could think about measuring or moving towards if we want to in our work. So first, an AIDS-competent community has the knowledge and skills to prevent AIDS and a mean of translating this information into action in their own lives. They have social spaces for dialogue and critical thinking so that people can collectively renegotiate individual and social norms that might negatively impact the health and well-being of the community at large. They have a sense of agency, ownership, and responsibility about the response to the epidemic. They have a sense of solidarity and common purpose that allows people to work together despite potentially competing interests and to tackle the problem collectively. And they have access to bridging social capital that allows them to sort of connect with resources from outside communities or organizations. And that sort of looks at like the intersectional approach that, again, everyone sort of talks about. So the value of having an AIDS competent community, for me, I think, is when we look at questions of things like zero adaptation strategies, right, which are strategies that people are sort of using to address risk in their lives, and I put risk in quotation marks, that are other than condoms use, right? So zero sorting, viral load, withdrawing, negotiating safety with partners, topping or bottoming depending on the zero status of the partner, right? And I think the thing that an AIDS competent community would really give us in this situation is the fact that, we have these words, but nobody really defines them in the same way. And especially in the academic researcher, like zero sorting, like sometimes it's just like they ask someone if they knew the status of the person that they had sex with, and then that if they didn't know, then they weren't zero sorting. But they don't even sort of figure out whether it's assumptions or how they figured out someone's status, right? So there's all these discussions that we need to be having about what is zero sorting, right? Because articles will say like zero sorting doesn't work, but I think that zero sorting does work. Like people just aren't doing it right? Like we don't have really good group definitions and guidelines about and agreements about what zero sorting is, or many of these other different strategies and how effective they are. So the second piece, I know I'm going over. I'm going to finish at the third point. Is the capacity of individual humans to act independently and to make and act upon their own decisions. And this really just highlights the idea that people need to be able to make their own decisions, and that has to be okay. And it's really, obviously tied to the definition of enabling environments. You can't necessarily do everything that you want to if you don't have an environment that allows for that to happen. But it also makes sure that one social good isn't placed too far above others. So it prevents, as you see here, the sacrifice of broader social development goals just for the sake of HIV prevention. And it also calls for social valuation. So as a group, we need to agree transparently and openly about sort of what our important values are. Lastly, building health enabling environments, I think is pretty self-explanatory, so we don't really need to go into that. Access to appropriate health and social services, economic empowerment, freedom from discrimination. These are the broad social structural issues, and I can't tell you exactly how we need to deal with them. We have some ideas. There are like human rights complaints that are going on. So there are lots of different ideas, and this is sort of part of the work that we need to do. But this is how they sort of pull it all together. And I really like this model because you see that in the center, it's not the individual. It's not, up to each person to take on full responsibility for their status and for their decisions and for their sexual behaviors. It's so much more than that. So I was going to talk about what we can actually do, but maybe that is what the panel can reflect on after our presentation. Thank you, everybody. I just want to say thank you. Thank you. I also want to say love each other, obviously, and thank you to the Community-Based Research Center, Professor Dan Allman, who sort of oversaw this project, Chi-Chang Lau, who is a very dear colleague of mine, and my uncle Danny, who died in '98 and tested positive in Vancouver. So Vancouver has a very special place in my heart. Thank you, everybody.